Welcome to VLGA Connect. I'm Kathryn Arndt and you're listening to the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello everyone and welcome to VLGA Connect. It's a special edition of the program today. I'm joined by the CEO of the VLGA, making a increasingly rare appearance these days, Kathryn Arndt. Hello and welcome back.
Hi Chris, yes, I'm coming out of my box and breathing the fresh air, and I love your summary end of year attire, looking very relaxed and comfortable, as we should be when we're talking to one of our integrity agencies.
Absolutely right. I very rarely wear a suit and I certainly don't wear a tie these days anymore. Well, pretty much not for anyone. I thought about it for David Wolf though. David Wolf is here as our guest today, the IBAC Deputy Commissioner. Great to see you, David. How have you been?
Indeed, Chris. Great to see you and Kathryn once again. Very well. Obviously, it's been quite a hectic period for us in terms of the work across the sector and obviously tracking the results of the recent elections quite closely as well.
We'll no doubt get some of those reflections from you during the course of the conversation today, but we've sort of had this scheduled for a while because back in October, if we can take people back a couple of months, there were two very important reports that came out from IBAC, one updating the perceptions of corruption in the sector, and pretty much hot on its heels was the Operation Leo report. So we might try and touch on both of those today. But firstly, perceptions of corruption, David, just remind us, this is a piece of research that you've done over a few years now, correct?
Indeed. It's a really important piece of work for us because it allows us to measure, as I said, perceptions of the corruption across the sector and also pinpoint some of those areas where people in the sector identify some of the risks. And as we build up the data over a number of surveys, it's really interesting to do those comparisons and also the comparisons with state and local government operations. So it's a fascinating piece of work, and the data coming out of it is really worthy of a good read if you're in the sector and have that that focus on integrity matters.
So David, how do perceptions of corruption in local government compare to the actual prevalence of corruption and misconduct in the sector?
It's a really difficult question to ask. We know what the perceptions are because we run the survey and we have the data. What's the reality? That's really difficult. We can only judge that perhaps on reports or notifications and ultimately our investigations. So we go, I think, to the first part about the perceptions. It's really important to understand that perceptions over the entire sector are drawn from people's experience, what they see, hear, read. And this survey in particular was done not far after Operation Sandon. So you'd expect people to perceive there are things wrong, not just at Casey, but broader across the sector. So that may well have influenced some of the findings around the broader sector perceptions. The next question we drill down to is about the individual respondents in their workplace and what's the perception of corruption within their workplace. And I think the overall perception was around 63-4% thereabouts. In the workplace, it came down to around the very low 20% believed it was a problem in their workplace. So that's interesting in itself. And then I think there was an additional question about whether people had observed matters that could be considered corruption that came down to the low teens again. So that's encouraging. There's a perception more broadly that there's corruption risks in the sector. But when you come down to the individual workplace and matters that have been seen, it's a much more reduced number. The next part of the answer is around, well, what's the reality? And that's the difficult thing to answer. Yes, we get reports of and notifications of issues, complaints through our systems, which we deal with and address. Many are dismissed; they don't have basis, but some are referred or investigated. But I can only really talk about the matters that we've investigated and what we found. And Operation Leo is a very stark example of that. Those behaviours existing within another major metropolitan council.
And we will come to that shortly. Just those numbers you were quoting there, David, have you seen them move over time as you've conducted this research?
Yes, they do. They haven't shifted a great deal. There's some, I think, as I said, the comparison between state and local is really interesting. Out of this last survey, the thing that really struck me for the state level was when we surveyed suppliers and whether they had concerns about providing submissions for contracts for state government versus their interaction with local government. And there seemed to be, from the people that responded, there was much greater confidence in their business dealings with local government sector. And I thought that was really encouraging.
And how much of that do you think is influenced by the fact that we are seeing more of a spotlight being shone on councillor behaviour more generally across the sector, not just in Victoria, I should say?
Yeah, I think the last term has been fascinating from a local government observer, like we all are. There was clearly much greater intervention by the state in many councils through monitors and administration. We had our investigations of the two major councils. So it was quite prolific around what the state was doing to oversight local government, to really draw a spotlight into the conduct and behavioural issues. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it really raises the profile of integrity issues and hopefully will influence behaviours over time. The fascination for me will be what this next council term looks like. One thing that we and the integrity system had considerable engagement with the council sector, local government sector in the lead up to the elections, both us, the local government inspectorate, the electoral commission, and then ongoing, we've had more engagement with councils, including the ombudsman as part of the integrity system. And I think that's been really important as well. I think our profile across the sector is as high as it's ever been with that engagement process as well. So dovetailing that into the actions from the previous term, I'll be fascinated to see how this term pans out.
So David, just an extension of that, how have community expectations changed in relation to corruption and misconduct in the local government sector? Do you think councillors are now more accountable for their behaviour than ever before? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, look, I do, Kathryn. I think the understanding of what's right and what's wrong hasn't changed, but I think people are more engaged in doing something about it if they have reservations, and there's a more awareness now of where to go to take those reservations or complaints. So I think that's a really positive change, and that sort of then reflects back into councils and the way they conduct themselves, particularly councils that may have thought that they were less visible, less on the radar, whereas now I think that's changed. And as I said, the engagement we've undertaken, it seems to me like our message is really getting across to the councillor group, and I hope that message is getting across to the community as well. It feels that way to me.
David, can we perhaps talk a bit about Operation Leo? It was, as you mentioned earlier, focused on one particular council, Moonee Valley Council, and it found that some of the councillors there, who are no longer on the council, I should point out, use their position as elected representatives to inappropriately influence council decisions in favour of one particular local stakeholder. Is your view that this is an isolated incident to Moonee Valley, or should we be concerned that it's perhaps more systemic than that?
So perhaps I'll frame a response this way. If you remember when Operation Sandon was released, it was a very significant report with sweeping recommendations for the sector in terms of governance and integrity. Really pleasing to see that the state has acted on the majority of those, and we've seen that positive change. One of the questions I was asked at the time when we released that report and those recommendations was, is this appropriate, that level of change, considering the investigation related to one council, and surely not, that this is not reflected across the state. Only months later, we're investigating the similar themes at another major metropolitan council where councillors have engaged in conduct that they've used the role, the office of councillor, to seek personal benefit at the expense of the broader municipality, in effect betraying the ratepayers and residents of the municipality. So that was really disappointing to see, and it goes to my point that it's not isolated. It can happen in any council, so it's important to have that understanding. So we looked at the theme, and what are the themes of these two councils? How did this conduct arise? How did it flourish? And what were the drivers behind it? And ultimately, it was councillors using their position to enrich themselves at the expense of the municipality, and that was one of the clear disappointing things. The themes or the consistent issues that we saw in both investigations were quite stark to me. and I think this will resonate with you, Chris, given your background, but in both instances, the relationship between the administration on council and the councillors was really poor and was quite disrespectful. And you could see that the distrust between the two groups had grown over time. There's quite a gap there, and efforts to bridge that gap were just proven ineffective. Part of the reason was the administration in both cases were trying to apply policies and process to ensure good decision making. Those councillors that were minded not to act appropriately were using mechanisms to avoid those processes to achieve their outcomes. So that was really disappointing. One of the other key themes that we saw was that the relationships with the external parties that the councillors were intending to favour to derive those benefits, those relationships had commenced from little things, from associations, meetings, often events, some hospitality or some minor gifts were the genesis of it. And effectively, external parties grooming councillors to build that relationship to then ultimately call in that favour when they needed it. And it was quite incredible to see how particular councillors were justifying their actions and not conscious of the way that they're acting and how they're affecting their decisions improperly.
David, just a quick follow-up question on that. I noticed that report came out right before the election, during the election period. I imagine there was some deep thought that went into the timing of that release.
Yeah, absolutely there was, Chris. We're obviously conscious of the calendar and what's occurring in terms of process, but we also have our internal process that when a piece of work is ready, then we will produce it and publish it. We had hoped to have that ready many weeks beforehand, but we had to go through some processes here which do take time. But we felt it was important to produce that work as soon as we could. We felt it was important. The investigation was known because of some of the overt actions we'd taken in terms of search warrants, and we thought it was incredibly important for the municipality of Moonee Valley to understand what we'd investigated, the issues we'd investigated, and the outcomes. Hence the timing of it, I think, was in that caretaker period.
David, you spoke about the commentary that came out when Operation Sandon came out, and also Operation Leo from, the local government sector itself, and also other stakeholders, that you can't suggest, or there shouldn't be a suggestion, that these issues are occurring across the board. And you've talked a little bit about the fact that you've applied a risk assessment approach in the investigations that you conducted. But what additional measures does IBAC think needs to be put in place from a governance perspective to reduce the risk of this happening in the future?
Yeah, okay. So I think this is a really important topic to touch on, particularly now we're in that induction period for council. So my messaging when I'm out speaking to councillor groups is around firstly building that relationship. So new councils have the opportunity to form together and build strong relationships with the administration and work with the administration to deal with their processes, to deal with integrity matters, to make sure that to the extent possible they're completely transparent in their decision making, and give that leadership that the local community are really looking for, that really strong, cohesive leadership. So how do you do that? Firstly, you have a really consistent decision-making process. So you stick with that and make sure, as I said, that you can be as transparent as possible about it. That includes the conflict of interest regime, ensuring that the conflicts are appropriately determined. And we know that councillors are going to have conflicts by virtue of their relationships in the community. They're not necessarily a bad thing, but managing them is the critical element here, and being transparent about that. Really important that council and councillors, so administration and councillors, abide by the policies that really protect everybody working in that system. The key one there is that councillor staff interaction policy, and making sure that that's not transgressed. Sorry about that. But I think that's a really important one, because that's the one that often is the basis for angst between the two levels, or the two areas within the council group. And I think the decision-making process itself, something we asked for out of Sandon was model governance rules. And I think that's really important. If you talk about some of the reforms that are still yet to come in, mandating that process for all local governments, so there's harmonisation around how it's done for all councils, I think is really, really important. It provides consistency for the councils and the councillors so they know what the process is. There'd be less opportunity for that to be gamed, so be manipulated to achieve particular outcomes, particularly around your notice of motion and your amendments and bringing issues on that are left that are quite unusual. So we think that's really important and allows the state also to monitor how decisions are being made much more clearly. So we think that's a really important piece of work that's yet to come. But ultimately, I go back to that relationship issue. Like it's just that opportunity for administration and councillor groups to really build that strong relationship. And if you think about where the states had to intervene, the councils over the last council term, I think nearly all of them had a breakdown in that relationship.
David, you mentioned the model policies and governance rules, and that, interestingly enough, is also something that the recent parliamentary inquiry into the financial sustainability of local government highlighted was through their, interviews with members of the local government sector, CEOs and councillors. It's interestingly enough, that's also something that the sector itself is asking for. So hopefully with that next wave of governance or recommendations that came out of Sandon relating to council governance, those model governance rules will be picked up and prioritised.
David, perhaps if I can just follow on from you've given us, I think, a clear picture of where you think the priorities perhaps are in this coming term. Is your sense that councils are open to these reforms that are coming down the path? And perhaps more importantly, are new councillors fully aware of the need for them?
I am, Chris. I'm actually very positive about the sector right at this point in time. I get a sense that the 2020 Act, as we know, it was an enabling piece of legislation. I know that there is a desire in many parts of the legislation for clarity around what to actually do. And particularly those steps around governance rules or code of conduct, they've been embraced by councillors, and councillors can clearly see the benefit of having that consistency. So I think that sort of change is welcome. The engagement, the way they go about consultation, that's clearly their matters for individual councillors to undertake. But it's more those process things around how governance is enacted that I think that clarity from the state is really important. In terms of broader reforms, I think it's really early in the term to get to that. How councillors might be approaching that. As you know, the amount of information that's provided in that induction period, I know that councillors are feeling quite overwhelmed at the moment. That reflection perhaps will come once the strategic decisions and processes are dealt with in the first 6 months, and we get into the middle of next year. There might be time for the new councillor groups to reflect on what's good change for the sector.
Do you think? I know Kathryn's got a wrap-up question for you, but just before we get to that, do you think the number of new councillors, because we have quite a lot in the state, does that elevate the risk from the issues that you're monitoring for in the sector? Does it make you more alert to anything?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question because you look at it two ways. I think the election was really exciting for a number of reasons, but the refresh of councillor groups, some have had significant change, some have had that medium level change, some have had no change. But across the board, there's been, I think, pretty positive change. There's been some really high level candidates elected through the course of this election. And I think that goes to the point I was saying about my confidence for the sector for the next council term. One of the things that we're really hopeful is that there'll be less need for state intervention and it'll rebalance. And I think you used the term, we had the COVID election and the lockdown period, which is quite difficult for councillors and really difficult to form a harmonious group that are going to govern together. I'm hopeful that this term might be very different in how councils work together.
And David, I think you've just answered my wrap-up question, which was what were your reflections of this election period versus the previous, which was during lockdown. So I don't really need to ask that, but would like to give you the opportunity to close with any final comments.
Yep. Thanks very much. Look, there's a couple of things. In terms of the next steps that I can see that are important, I'm starting to think about the next elections and what needs to be in place. I'd still like to see the reforms to campaign donations. I think they're really important to the extent possible. Again, harmonisation with the state level, but some real reforms in real-time disclosure. And I think that will really benefit the transparency for elections and allow people to understand who's supporting who before they cast their ballot. So that's something that I'll be really interested in, and having those discussions over the next couple of years to see if we can achieve those reforms. I think there's still some work to be done in the council of conduct and the discipline model, noting that I think that message from the state and from us and from integrity agencies is really going to be back to councils to get onto those issues early, use the mechanisms available and try and resolve those conduct and discipline minor issues before they escalate into major issues. That'll be a really strong message, and we'll maintain that. But the reforms to that conduct process, I think, are still something that's a live issue, and we'd like to see some reforms over time. But again, from my contact with various councils already in this new term, I'm quite, as I said, positive about what I'm seeing, and what I am seeing is a real desire to get into the strategic elements that that councils are involved in, and think about how they can advocate for local governments at that higher level, and less of a desire to think about the more operational issues. And that's really positive again.
Absolutely. What a good note to end on. Thank you, David. Always great to catch up and to hear your thoughts. And I'm sure as your work progresses through this next term of council, there'll be opportunities to touch base with you down the path.
Indeed. Appreciate it, Chris. Thanks, Kathryn. Great to see you again.
Thanks, David.
And thank you to you, Kathryn, for joining me on this edition of VLGA Connect today. We'll talk to you again very soon.
Thanks, Chris. Always a pleasure.